I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Steve Ottersberg graduated from the Fort Lewis College with a BS in biochemistry. And in graduate school, he thrived on, in part, on synthetic organic chemistry, dedicated to designing novel new chemotherapeutic agents. So his passion for teaching in both organic chemistry and nutritional biochemistry at ASU led to a faculty position teaching chemistry at Fort Lewis College. As a chemist, Steve's two-plus decades of experience covers a broad range of fields, including pharmaceutical R&D, pharmaceutical sales, entrepreneurial endeavors, and industrial analytical laboratory management. As a member of both the AOAC International and the American Chemical Society, Steve remains at the forefront of current analytical methods, development, and defined standards for food analysis by the FDA and the USDA. Steve is enthusiastically motivated to drive the acceptance of cannabinoid chemistry within the world of professional chemists and destigmatize the marijuana industry as a whole. As a fellow person with a background in analytical chemistry, I'm very excited to introduce Steve Ottersberg. Thank you.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Portland. How's everybody doing? 4 p.m. on a Friday, and you're stuck in a conference during one of the most rare events in Portland, Oregon, right? The sun's out. So everybody give themselves a big, big hand of applause. Thanks for being here. I'll do my best to keep you guys up. So that was a pretty impressive. I was standing there thinking, is that me? Who is this guy he's talking about? So those of you that don't know me, I did a series of board review courses for Southwest College that earned me an honorary naturopathic degree. We and me, meaning the class of 2000, developed a workbook that we did biochemistry board reviews. And we would go through this entire workbook, interactive thing, and people loved it. So because of that, I got an honorary naturopathic degree, but I'm also married to a naturopath. I've been influenced by a lot of naturopaths. I was just telling Louise Edwards on the way in how when I was an undergrad at Fort Lewis, I was a synthetic organic chemist, and NMR was one of the first weird things for me. And notice I start doing weird hand gestures because in nature, there's all kinds of energetic things that are happening that we may or may not be able to explain, but we know that they're happening, right? So Louise helped me to wrap my head around nuclear magnetic resonance with analogies within homeopathy. So, what we're going to be talking about today are cannabinoids, and I'm sure that if you are anywhere within 1,000 miles of Portland, you can smell me. And I want to be able to give clinicians a different perspective on cannabis chemistry. My background is heavily steeped in analytical chemistry, and I've done a lot of work specifically in the cannabinoid industry. And there's a lot of things that we're seeing in cannabis that commercially produced that's positive, and some things that are not so positive. But I want to focus on the clinical pharmacology and the pharmacogenomics of the variability of cannabis response that you're likely going to see in patients that you are recommending cannabis to or not, because how many in here see patients that are using cannabis medicinally? Wow. And how many of you are seeing patients that you don't even recommend it? And they're still, I mean, whether you recommend it or not, you're going to have patients in your practice that are using cannabis, likely. I think the probability is relatively high these days as more states go legal. So I want to give you from my drug design and pharmacology experience about how we respond to cannabis. Part of it is pharmacokinetics, right? Part of it is pharmacogenomics, and I think it's important to look at things simply and remember that nothing in our physiology happens unless it expresses from our DNA, right? So we have events in our life that acetylate are histones, which cause them to open and express, right? So that's epigenetics. So, you hear clinically things about genetics, and genetics is great. That tells us what the code is in that DNA strand, but epigenetics tells us what's expressing. And so remember that you're going to have different patients that are going to have responses that are individual based upon their genetics, but also based upon their epigenetics. So what are their triggers in their life that make them respond to cannabinoids differently? And one of them is diet, as you might expect that I would say. So, Russell, what do you think about that? How about that for some essential fatty acid derivative? Does that not just like get you rubbing? You have to understand, Russell and I spent a lot of time together in the past talking about the eicosanoid system. And when Russell and I were talking about the eicosanoid system, late 90s, we didn't even really know about endocannabinoids then, did we? I mean, here's the problem with cannabis in general, is the entire thing was learned backwards because we've known for how many, a lot of years. I mean, Chinese medicine, Materia Medica, had cannabis, right? It originated in the West Indies, in the Himalayas, right? I mean, Jamaica did not, cannabis didn't come from Jamaica. Cannabis came from Himalaya to Jamaica. And so there's a lot of crossover, it turns out, between prostaglandins, what Russell and I were geeking out on, seems like decades ago now, a few less grays back then. And what we see is because the endocannabinoids are made from essential fatty acids, remember, essential fatty acids come from where? From your diet. So it's really easy to generalize. And here's one of the big limitations that you're going to see in studies on the endocannabinoid system, is that a lot of the studies only focus on two of the cannabinoids that are listed up there. The top two, the one on the left, AEA, is arachidonyl ethanolamide, and arachidonyl ethanolamide also has the name anandamide because it was called the bliss molecule. Anybody feeling blissed off right now? If you're not, what do? Breathe. Think about the runner's high. The runner's high is largely attributed to arachidonyl ethanolamide being released in the brain. And so remember, where are essential fatty acids stored? They're not stored in vesicles because they're fat soluble, right? They are membranes. And so there's a class of enzymes that come from genes, right? So the enzymes that are expressed to produce arachidonyl ethanolamide is pulling arachidonic acid from the cell membrane and converting it into a now hormone-like substance, just like the prostaglandins, leukotrienes. Same kind of framework as the eicosanoids built on essential fatty acids. So on the right, we have 2-arachidonyl glycerol, which is another arachidonic acid derivative. Now, if you notice, I'm focusing on just one essential fatty acid, right? Most studies that you're going to see on the endocannabinoid system are focusing on just those two in their analysis in human tissues when they're looking at endocannabinoid research. Well, it turns out there are others. So second down on the right is the DHA derivative of ethanolamine, which is the omega-3 version of arachidonyl ethanolamide, the one we call the bliss molecule. And it turns out that the ratio of the DHA derivative of ethanolamine and arachidonyl ethanolamine is what directly influences something that we call endocannabinoid tone. And so endocannabinoid tone you could think of as being like your ability to accommodate stress is part of your endocannabinoid tone. Because remember, when you look at the big picture, the endocannabinoid system is controlling some of our really fundamental processes like hunger, GI motility, our immune response, Turns out that CB2 actually is one of the most important factors in maintenance of the blood-brain barrier and the GI mucosal barrier. And so when you think about this interrelationship between essential fatty acid balance and endocannabinoid tone, it would make sense then what we see the reference on the bottom. Nutritional omega-3 deficiency abolishes endocannabinoid-mediated neuroplasticity. Oliver Manzoni is a French researcher who's doing some groundbreaking research on the endocannabinoid system, and one of the things that he observed is when you deprive mice of omega-3s and give them too many omega-6s, sound familiar? Do we have another name for that? The standard American diet? Rich in the industrial seed oils. So what they're seeing is that these mice that are omega-3 deficient are losing neuroplasticity. So they're literally losing the ability to form new neural networks. Kind of makes me want to go out and get some omega-3s, right? So, this is one of the things that struck me about the DHA derivative of ethanolamine is that when it was discovered before the endocannabinoids were even discovered. And when the DHA derivative of ethanolamine was discovered, they called it synaptamide. Because in the neurological models that they were doing in these cell line studies, this molecule, the DHA derivative of ethanolamine, actually stimulated new synapse formation. Anybody in here think they could use some more synapse formation? Count me in, please. So I know this sounds like a commercial for DHA, but it just turns out that there is a lot of evidence that DHA is probably one of the most important factors in how our diet influences our endocannabinoid tone. And so think about that when you have a patient that comes in, if they're eating a super rich, super high omega-6 diet, and you put them on a cannabis therapy, they may not respond as favorably as if you can get them on some omega-3s before you get them on anything associated with cannabis. There's actually some online forums in Colorado where these kind of biohacker underground guys are talking about, yeah, man, if you take 3,000 milligrams of DHA before you vape, you really, really get a different high. And it turns out that it also influences things that are pretty essential. Does anybody in here think neuroplasticity is essential or luxury? Essential. I mean, if I were given the choice to lose a finger or have more neuroplasticity, what's it going to be? Tough choice. I think I'd go neuroplasticity. Okay. So when we talk about the pharmacology of these agents, the pharmacology of arachidonyl ethanolamide and 2-arachidonylglycerol and the other endocannabinoids is they bind to cannabinoid receptors. And remember, we learned everything backwards. We discovered THC 3 million years ago. In 1963, Raphael McCoolum characterized THC isolated from cannabis for the first time in a laboratory. And from 1963, we didn't even know that there was a cannabinoid receptor until 80s. I think 1982 was when the first cannabinoid receptor was expressed in a lab. That's a long time in science. So something went wrong in the scientific process. And, there's a lot of political things regarding how scientists can conduct research. But when we finally learned that we had cannabinoid receptors, at that time in the 80s, we still didn't know about the endocannabinoid system. So we learned about the plant molecule THC first, then we learned that there were receptors, then we learned that we have endogenous binders of those receptors. Okay, one last thing about these structures. This thing on the bottom left, can anybody recognize that molecule that's attached to a fatty acid? No? No? Serotonin. That is a serotonin amide ester of arachidonic acid, which is an endocannabinoid. So imagine serotonin being combined with fatty acid, and now does it have serotonin binding properties? Probably. It has endocannabinoid receptor binding properties? Yes, absolutely. And what other things does it bind to? There's also a dopamine derivative. So bottom line is we don't know that much about the endocannabinoid system right now. You're going to see a lot of focus on just the two arachidonic acid derivatives. And as we progress, we're going to learn there's a lot of things that the endocannabinoid system influences that we can fine-tune. Okay, so this is why we want endocannabinoid function from the perspective of CB1. So CB1 was originally expressed in neurological cell cultures, and this is a representation of the synaptic action of the CB1 receptor. And notice that the receptor, oh, whoops, I forgot, we don't have a laser pointer. Okay, imagine with me, see, the receptor is presynaptic in this model, and the molecule that binds to the receptor, which is the endocannabinoid 2-arachidonyl glycerol, or arachidonyl ethanolamide, those molecules are produced presynaptically. And so what this represents, because it's a presynaptic signaling molecule that operates postsynaptically, it's called a retrograde feedback system. So you could think of this as being like the anti-lock brakes. Anybody drive on snow recently? I haven't, so I'm going to have to rely on you. So back in the day, when we would slam on our brakes, on the snow, we don't wreck into people, right? And we still stop. So that's based upon this same type of retrograde feedback signaling. And so when you think about this from just very simplistically, on the left, we have a glutamate releasing neuron, which I would consider excitatory. On the right, we have GABA, which is inhibitory. And so remember that the general tone of your central nervous system is the balance between excitatory and inhibitory neurotransmission, right? I mean, this is the juice that keeps us flowing on a day-to-day basis at the most fundamental level. What happens here is that the CB1 receptor, when it's bound to what I refer to as an agonist, the agonist causes a response. In this case, it blocks the release of those glutamate vesicles. And so if it's blocking glutamate, then it's slowing down the excitatory side of this pathway. And we got to go back a little bit to the affinities. So arachidonyl ethanolamide is a high affinity agonist, and then 2-arachidonyl glycerol is high affinity full agonist. And so there are all of these different binding properties that in chemistry we refer to because it's pretty important. The agonist is going to elicit the normal response of the enzyme or the receptor that it binds to. A partial agonist will sometimes or sometimes it won't. So it's kind of like a random number generator. And somehow all of these things have to come into a coherent signal. And so because of their different affinities, they're used at different times. And so arachidonyl ethanolamide is referred to as tonic because it's kind of always there at low levels. I'm saying it backwards. It's 2-arachidonyl glycerol is tonic. It's always there, low levels, and just kind of maintains tone. And then arachidonyl ethanolamide is phasic, meaning it's released only in short bursts when there's a huge spike in excitatory neurotransmission. And that spike is probably the most important neuroprotective effect that these agents have. And that's probably the thing that, you're going to hear people in the industry, I like to refer to it as bro science. Oh, bro, we'll cure your cancer. There's a lot of misconceptions, And there's also a lot of good anecdotal evidence that comes out of the black market. But in general, it's difficult to find information from the cannabis industry that's balanced and fair. And I want it to be 100% understood that I will never stand up here and tell you that cannabis is going to cure anything. When you talk about the functionality of cannabis, most of my experience is in the oncology world because of Naisha's work, and for quality of life, there may not be anything better ever. Because, remember, the endocannabinoids are important for things like fear extinction. So when you think about, tonic versus phasic, all of these different patterns that are happening within our central nervous system, these molecules and this system is designed to fine-tune that whole system to keep it coherent. Okay, so when I refer to endocannabinoid tone, this is a loosely used term which could mean that somebody is doing good in terms of their ability to produce cannabinoids and their receptors are functioning, meaning when the cannabinoid binds to the receptor elicits the appropriate response. Because remember, we have genetic hiccups. There's a lot of genetic influence. There are SNPs within all of the enzymes in the endocannabinoid system that can influence the outcome. So for instance, there is some data with the enzyme FAAH, far right center. That enzyme is responsible for the breakdown of the bliss molecule, right? So shouldn't FAH have a smile or a frown underneath it? Well, it kind of does. I mean, FAH is your enemy if you want to feel bliss, right? Does anybody know the pharmaceutical industry history with cannabinoids? Oh my God, it's been horrible. They haven't had real good luck with the endocannabinoid system in general, and part of it's because they started out with synthetic THC. Anybody here familiar with Marinol or see Marinol in action? Anybody see a lot of positive response with Marinol? No. That's the most common response I hear from any clinician that has ever seen Marinol. And I worked in the pharmaceutical industry, and Marinol was really easy to sell against because it was horribly tolerated. The most common side effect of taking THC synthetically is dysphoria. And I think that if I had just had a cancer diagnosis, that dysphoria might be one of the worst things that I could do to my immune system, right? I mean, come on. So when you think about things like fear extinction, there's a researcher in Colorado that did a study on antelope in the plains, and what he saw was there are plains antelope in Colorado that are dying of heart attacks. And they're thinking that the reason that they're dying of heart attacks is because they're imagining saber-toothed tigers. Last time I told this story, there was a 2-year-old girl in the audience, and she stood up, "There are no saber-toothed tigers." Like, wow. Beaten to the punchline by a 2-year-old. And so, why are these antelope dying thinking that they're being chased by saber-toothed tigers? Well, it's in their DNA, right? They were programmed. Their environment programmed their epigenetics to express as if there was a saber-toothed tiger, right? And even though there wasn't one, the stress is real enough that when you are up against stress like this, it's a huge assault on your central nervous system. And the feedback mechanism here is incredibly neuroprotective for a lot of the neurodegenerative diseases because they tend to be characterized by high glutamate signals, especially NMDA related. All right, Russell, I told you, leukotrienes, prostaglandins, the whole 9 yards right there. And who knew? I mean, so up on the top we have substrates, which include monoacylglycerols, so 2-arachidonoglycerol would fall in that category, 2-arachidonoglycerol, arachidonic acid, arachidonyl ethanolamide, and the other N-acetyl ethanolamides, which remember includes the omega-3 derivatives, and some neurotransmitter. So when you look at these are the enzymes that break down the endocannabinoids. Why is COX-2 in here? Is it a typo? No, it turns out that there's so much structural similarity between our endocannabinoids and the precursors to our eicosanoids that COX-2 actually metabolizes both of our two classic endocannabinoids. And so it's theorized that this is why COX-2 selective agents might have a mild antidepressant effect, because they help to stabilize the endocannabinoid tone by slowing the breakdown of the molecules that make us feel bliss. Oh, back to the bliss. Pharmaceutical industry, anybody remember the other huge flop? Remdesivir it never made it to market in the United States. It made it to market in Europe. It is a full CB1 receptor antagonist. So when remdesivir binds to the receptor elicits no response, is what a full antagonist means. And so in post-marketing data, they decided to pull this drug from the market because of a horrible side effect, which was suicide. So lessons learned from the pharmaceutical industry: THC is not good as a standalone drug. And if you block CB1 receptors completely, people do not experience bliss. Right? So back to pharmacogenomics. If we know that we're working with a client that has mutations on any of these genes, we might be able to predict that they may respond differently than somebody that does not have the mutations. Correct? Okay. So when we look at our gross physiology, CB1 and CB2 receptors are expressed throughout the human body. I mentioned earlier that CB2 receptors are particularly important in the blood-brain barrier. They influence cytokine tone directly in the blood-brain barrier. So really, really important for neurological diseases, right? I mean, how many of our chronic neurological diseases can be characterized by high cytokines? So CB2 was originally expressed in rat spleens, and so because of that, most of the early data suggested that CB2 was only expressed in immune cells, and that's not true. It is true that they're highly expressed in immune cells, but we're finding more and more cells as time goes on that are producing CB2 receptors. So, and specifically, I really got to geek out heavily on CB2 and the central nervous system because Nation and I got to speak to the Rocky Mountain Neurological Society. That was fun. Those guys and women were super brilliant. So CB1, when we think about the physiological response, obviously cravings, appetite. I remember, dealing with patients with cachexia, one of the most challenging things is they lose their appetite. And there is nothing, absolutely nothing in the world that is better for increasing appetite in somebody with cachexia than good old THC. Turns out that cannabinoids decrease motility in the gut, and this is probably why cannabis-based therapies tend to be really good for those spastic conditions of the gut, like Crohn's and IBS. There's a really important balancing effect. It's similar to vitamin D, how cannabinoids influence immune function. There was a recent study in the last 5 years that showed that delta-9 THC suppressed an immune response to breast cancers. And read closer into the data, and it said that it was THC was being administered at 25 milligrams per kilogram. I did just quick math in my head, and that's like 1,500 milligrams of THC. Anybody in here know anybody that can do 1,500 milligrams of THC? Well, it turns out we have a new emergency room diagnosis in Colorado. It is temporary marijuana-induced psychoses. You've all experienced it when your stupid brother made those brownies. And we'll get into this more in upcoming slides, but there's a first-pass metabolism that happens when you consume THC orally. So brownies are as unpredictable as anything that you could imagine pharmacologically, and it's because orally THC goes through first-pass metabolism in the liver, is converted to 11-hydroxy THC. Delta-9 THC, when inhaled, goes pretty quickly to the brain and has a really predictable half-life of about 3 to 4 hours. Agreed? You smoke, you feel it pretty quickly, and it's pretty much gone in 3 hours or less. And when you consume THC orally, that conversion of the Delta-9 into 11-hydroxy is conducted by cytochrome 2C9. And the pharmacogenomics people chuckle. Evil laugh, right? Why? Why is 2C9 the evil enzyme? Because it's so difficult to predict clinically, because there's 26, we call it polymorphic. There are many polymorphisms in the cytochrome 2C9 gene. So if you're on this side of the room, you're likely an ultra slow variant 2C9. You're kind of slow. You're slower. It's faster than them, but you're still slow. You're average, statistical mean, and it just keeps going. And you can do genetic tests, and it's pretty well characterized because there are so many drugs metabolized by cytochrome 2C9 that the pharmaceutical industry is very interested in that data. So we have a good, firm understanding of these pharmacokinetics. The tricky thing is there's this high variability of the conversion of delta-9 THC to 11-hydroxy, and then the 11-hydroxy has to be glucuronidated to be eliminated. So the end result is orally consumed THC has a half-life of anywhere from 7 to 72 hours. Wow, how's that for a ballpark therapeutic window? Oh. And this is why when you ate that one brownie, it may have lasted for 3 days. Horrible, horrible therapeutic profile, unless you have somebody that's in such dire pain that they would probably rather, continue on to other spiritual playgrounds and leave us behind. But all right, where are we going? We got gross physiology. Oh. Now the pharmacogenomics. So some of this is just really, really stupid party humor, but some of it's really interesting. So this study is a pharmacogenomic profiling of polymorphisms that are associated with processing of facial expressions. Anybody know the term resting bitch face? It's a DMSR diagnosis, right? This is, I don't recognize resting bitch face. Naisha says, this is my I think everybody's too happy gene. But this is an example of, so what they were looking at was polymorphisms in the gene for the receptor CB1. And when you think about cannabis use, this could be potentially problematic, and especially for teenage boys, because teenage boys already have poor sense of judgment. And that's all I have to say about the survival of teenage boys. So this is my world, our SNPs and RS numbers. So if anybody of you have done any work with 23andMe data, all of that data that's spit out on polymorphisms, remember, this data is ran on these massive, multiplex sequencing machines that weren't even around when I was in grad school. We were still running gels when I was in grad school, and it was painful. So to see all of this data churning is so cool. But they're running a panel of 750,000 SNPs, and they catalog them using RS numbers. And so we can plug these RS numbers into databases like PharmGKB. PharmGKB is a pharmacogenomics database that will give you really, really good, clear, categorized data, meaning they categorize the studies based upon, is it an animal study? Is it a preclinical trial? So there's a scoring system, so you know that the data that goes in has been rated by, the Stanford, whoever that put this database together. So a really useful tool. This actually just came from random Googling on Google Scholar. But this is an example of if this, you have a patient that has this polymorphism, maybe a high THC strain is not good for them because they may already have some cannabinoid-mediated changes in their perception of the world around them that are not favorable. The CB2 receptor seems to have a really strong influence on our core reward systems. And it's likely because there's a lot of receptor binding crossover within the endocannabinoid system. Cannabinoids bind to cannabinoid receptors. They bind to vanilloid receptors. They bind to opiate receptors. There's a new class they're just calling GPR55 because we can't come up with names for enzymes anymore as fast as we discover them. And so because of that, people often refer to the cannabinoids as being promiscuous. And the point of this study is they're looking at the reinforcing actions of alcohol, and they're looking at CB2 receptor knockout mice. And so there seems to be some connection with the mu opioid receptor gene at the genetic level that we can't even get into that because I don't even understand it. The way that geneticists talk these days is really, really complex. But we see that there is a definite connection between the reward feedback from ethanol that is opiate related in these CB2 knockout mice. And of course, remember, mouse studies are good to a point. Rat studies might be better than, the progression we hope refines itself to coherence by the time we get to large organisms, but you never know, right? We've had to go back and relearn things in science. This is a CB2 gene polymorphism that's related to alcoholism in Japan, and I have to dedicate this to my undergrad roommate, Tiger. Tiger was Japanese. He could drink one beer, and he just turned beet red and was drunk for like a day. It was kind of scary. Dopamine receptors and dopamine transporter polymorphisms seem to have an influence on how the dopamine receptor 1 and dopamine receptor 2 tone is distributed. The dopamine, you remember that there's numerous other dopamine receptors, but the dopamine 1 and dopamine 2 receptors are thought to be kind of counterproductive or regulating to each other because DR1 stimulates the production of cyclic AMP and DR2 inhibits the production of cyclic AMP. So this is an actual screenshot from PharmGKB. This is the genomics database. And so what they're showing here is there's 3 different alleles for the dopamine receptor D2, and they saw some differences that were significant in terms of alcohol and reward behavior between these different subgroups. And so remember that there's a strong connection between how cannabis influences our central nervous system and dopaminergic neurotransmission. Part of this is related to the actual production of dopamine. And so polymorphisms in dopamine beta hydroxylase can cause lower levels of dopamine to be released. And these are the kind of studies that they're using brain imaging. And so they can do these real-time brain scans to see, oh, the dopamine is being released in the fancy neurological anatomical name that I don't remember. But what they're seeing, this was kind of cool because they're seeing some specific changes in dopamine neurotransmission that were broken out pretty cleanly within these different genotypes of the enzyme, or the gene for the enzyme that produces dopamine. I thought that was pretty cool. Clinical annotation for levodopa. Remember that levodopa is a precursor of dopamine that's used for Parkinson's. And so you would think that there's probably going to be a connection between the endocannabinoid system and Parkinson's, because the endocannabinoid system, and I may not have mentioned this earlier, we looked at GABA and glutamate, but there are other types of neurons that the cannabinoid receptors are working on too. It's not just GABA and glutamate. They're working on the serotonin, the dopamine, and all the other receptors to kind of fine-tune them. These patients had differences in response that were specific to their genotypes for dopamine beta hydroxylase. Another alcohol study, and this is with the opioid receptor mu1, and what they observed is that there was a gene allele specific trait associated with cravings for alcohol. And so, I'm using these as examples of how we can use current pharmacogenomic data, and we're not quite there yet with cannabis. There's a couple companies that are offering cannabis profiles. If any of you are doing testing with Nutrition Genome, they just expanded their cannabis profile. There's a company in LA called Endocanna Health. Endocanna Health is working on developing a 23andMe-like test that will give you some of the clues that we have for, can a patient tolerate high THC, or do they need to start on low THC?
Do you have a preference about Maximized Genetics as another product offering out there, or do you know any other?
I don't know about it.
Maximized Genetics does another RS number thing.
Oh, it's I haven't seen it. No, thanks. And so the idea is we can look at, things like the crossover between the opiate receptor system and the endocannabinoid receptor system. And when you think about the fact that cannabinoids are binding to opiate receptors, it becomes even more important that we understand this crossover, because it can help us to deal with things like the opiate epidemic. I mean, why is it that is it now the highest cause of death right now is in the United States is opiate related? It's shocking the trends where it's going. But when you think about how to approach this plant medicine from a clinical perspective, it's important to recognize that there are also terpenoids within this plant that have pharmacological activity. And the reason I wanted to show, there's a genetic relationship between opiate crossover or between the opiate receptor system and the cannabinoid receptor system is because there are terpenoids that have opiate binding properties. The terpene myrcene, its analgesic effect can be blocked by naltrexone. So if an opiate receptor antagonist blocks it, then we have to think about this clinically. So that extra long half-life delta or 11-hydroxy THC combined with a high myrcene strain. Myrcene is often referred to as indica. I'm trying to get the industry away from using the terms indica and sativa because of crossbreeding for all the different purposes of hemp and cannabis. Strain names really don't mean anything, and we're trying to push towards the use of the term chemovar, because if you know what a chemovar is, you know that signature by a chemical imprint, and you've done some testing. And so when you think about strains or chemovars that are high in myrcene, they're likely having a pronounced effect on the endocannabinoid system and the opiate receptor system. And this is why when people refer to strains that are indicas, they say that the effect is couch lock. And it's because you're hitting these receptors that are bound by multiple agents from different angles. Okay, this one is interesting. AKT1 is one of those things that fine-tunes the G protein receptor systems. And just remember that G protein receptor systems are a receptor that are bound to the plasma membrane. And then you've got a whole series of proteins on the inside of the membrane that bind and elicit responses. This is an example of tonic versus phasic neurotransmission. The graph on the bottom, the tall spike, would be considered phasic. The long, drawn-out red curve would be considered tonic. And this particular example was just looking at how there are genetic mutations in AKT1 that influence how dopamine is released, not whether it's released or not. And what they saw was that the polymorphisms in the AKT1, which is fine-tuning the dopamine receptor, actually changed it from tonic to phasic. And COMT, so this is a pathway that I used to use to teach for epigenetics. So I focused a lot on COMT because it turns out there's a lot of pretty well-characterized pharmacogenomic trials with COMT, and we have a pretty good understanding of its function. But it turns out that there are a few COMT SNPs that might make cannabis not such a good thing for some people. There are COMT SNPs that increase the risk of psychoses. And remember, that's our new emergency room diagnosis in Colorado, temporary marijuana-induced psychoses. It's from too much edibles, and it's true psychoses. You're not dying, but it's so believable that you're dying. It's a horrible experience. But did anybody here know how to reverse that effect? CBD? CBD can help because CBD is an inverse agonist of the cannabinoid receptor.
Activate munters.
Yeah, hot water. Or lemon. Lemon. Can you believe that? Or pine nuts. What's the other one? Oh, I'm looking around for Southwest grads. Calamus root, anyone? But anybody here worked with calamus root before? It's a strong, strong emetic. Yeah, Ipecac. So if you use calamus to antidote THC psychoses, be very gentle because it will likely induce emesis. And lemon peel or pine nuts actually have efficacy for reversing those effects. But a hot shower does too. Okay, so remember FAAH I said was the frowny face enzyme because it breaks down the bliss molecule? FAAH is not our friend if we're slow to produce anandamide, right? And remember, anandamide is part of where we get the runner's high. So in this clinical annotation, there was genotypic difference that was seen in the genes for FAH. I think that this is why some people just don't tolerate cannabis. I think there are slow variants of FAH, and I think the people that have slow FAH variants, and if they are fast to synthesize endocannabinoids, they're probably high endocannabinoid tone, and giving them THC is just probably never going to feel good. And if they have cytochrome 2C9 SNPs and you give them an edible, oh, look out. They're going to think they had a stroke. And it's going to be believable. Reversible, but believable. And, all right, I said I would never say that THC or CBD cures anything, right? Except for the blues. See, what caught my eye with this study is they're showing that CBD is an FAH inhibitor. So CBD covers the frowny face. So this is part of the reason why CBD has its positive neurological effects, is it helps you to stay a little bit happier. We're going to skip through that. I don't want to skip through this because I just saw an article published today on the effects of terpenoids on cytokines. Come on, plant medicine people. Hoorah, right? So the reason I had to stop here is because TNF-alpha. Remember, the inflammatory cytokines are there for a purpose, but we don't want them expressed all the time. Oh, yes, we got it in. Blood-brain barrier function. I didn't think I was going to get this one in. Okay, so this is the direct relationship between CB2 receptor function and blood-brain barrier permeability. Remember, we need blood-brain permeability because if we have insults to the brain, like cortisol, if we're in a Th2 state, if we're buzzing with NMDA from excitotoxins, or any of the other insults that could happen, and that's not a sunny side up egg with a CB2 receptor on it, that's a macrophage. And macrophages look so friendly when they look like a sunny side up egg, right? Well, he's got business to do, but he has to infiltrate the blood-brain barrier to get to the flies in the poop, right? I mean, you guys recognize the flies in the poop are on the wrong side of the blood-brain barrier, right? Okay. As long as you get that. So what CB2 does is it has a direct influence on the molecules that are like tied in knots. All of the tight junction proteins are expressed from CB2 receptor activation. And so the fundamental framework of that barrier is built on CB2 function. And I had to put a picture of a poop on because it's a naturopathic conference, right? That actually was the slide that I worked on for the Rocky Mountain Neurological Society. I didn't think that they were going to like it, and they loved it. Well, that's it. And so this is just another picture of what, the loose term endocannabinoid tone. And remember, endocannabinoid tone I use as a loose term because there's not one endocannabinoid tone. People are going to respond differently to high THC strains. People are going to respond differently to high myrcene strains. And so it's important to understand the basic pharmacokinetics at first. When you look at THC on the left and CBD on the right, they're structurally pretty similar, but they have dramatically different half-lives. Inhaled consumption of THC, 3 to 4 hour half-life. Oral, remember I said 7 to 72 hour half-life because of first pass metabolism, cytochrome 2C9. And for CBD, 56 to 71 hour half-life. Well, it takes about 3 days to get to steady state with that half-life, right? But once you get to steady state, it remains really constant for a long time. One of the things I want you to really understand about CBD is that it's often mislabeled. CBD is mislabeled as non-psychoactive. And CBD is psychoactive. CBD has a psychoactivity that's known as anxiolytic. Wow, I want to be on an anxiolytic, don't you? So remember, when you have patients with anxiety, CBD probably is really good because this is pharmacologically how it's described. All of the cannabinoids tend to have some analgesic effect, and remember, there's a strong crossover between the COX-2 system and prostaglandin inflammation and the endocannabinoid system. So it would seem natural that these are going to have analgesic effect both in a prostaglandin sense of the idea of analgesia, but also from the opiate side of how we think about analgesia. Okay, we've gone through this. This is our pharmacogenomic response to edibles, because cytochrome 2C9 is, remember, a highly polymorphic gene, so there are many variants expressed by this gene. And they say that delta-9 THC is mild and friendly, makes people happy, and probably a little bit too talkative. And 11-hydroxy scares Snoop. Snoop Dogg says he won't eat edibles because they scare him. Myrcene and caryophyllene are two of the terpenoids I would like to leave you with a different flavor. Remember that our terpenoids are the flavor and aroma components of our culinary spices. The flavor descriptions come from FEMA, which is the Flavor Extract, FEMA, Flavor Extract Manufacturers Association, has a flavor characterization website. And these are some of the different herbs and spices that produce myrcene. Myrcene, I think, is important because it's an opiate binding agent. I think it probably is a really good consideration for a lot of different types of chronic pain because it has opiate receptor binding properties, but I don't know that it has the habit-forming properties that the opiates have. Caryophyllene, absolute, one of my favorites because it's produced in high concentration in shiso. Any Japanese food lovers here? Shiso leaf is absolutely the most amazing terpenoid profile you will ever experience. And part of it's the spicy character of beta-caryophyllene. Beta-caryophyllene is also found in black pepper. And the reason I'm in love with beta-caryophyllene is because it is a CB2 selective agent, which is getting a lot of attention in drug design right now for a lot of different conditions. And that's it. Do we have any questions? Yes. With arthritis? That's tricky. I mean, there's,
Hey, Steve,
I don't know,
repeat
that's,
the question. Repeat the question. Thank you.
so if I'm understanding the question, the question is about arthritis pain and a strain that's not going to increase inflammation? If you have a patient that's having that kind of sensitivity, it's probably an immune response, more so than inflammation. Remember that plants just in general have a pretty strong immune, yeah. And so it could just be a sensitivity to it's pretty common, especially with extracts. People are taking, more and more concentrated extracts. We're getting a lot of some of the irritating compounds concentrated down with the cannabinoids. Yes?
So there's a lot of talk about like this nano and liposomal derived CBD, and then can you talk a little bit on the effects of that, and then maybe dosing as a...
Oh yeah, absolutely. I forgot when I should have pointed out dosing. In general, dosing for THC I would call 1 milligram a microdose. 10 milligrams is therapeutic for most people, and for some people, 10 milligrams will make them see visions of Jesus. For CBD, there's a lot of data pointing to 30 milligrams as being a therapeutic dose for a lot of different conditions, but there's also data with CBD upwards towards 300 milligrams for conditions like seizures. And so and just in general, from a clinical perspective, if you don't want to go through genetic testing and try to interpret all of that, and you have patients that are interested in using cannabis therapies who have not used cannabis therapies, always start them on cleaning up their essential fatty acids in their diet, then start them on a low dose, and I mean like 2 milligrams of CBD. Because CBD is well tolerated by a huge percentage of the population, but there are still people that will have sensitivities to CBD. And in general, the easiest way to figure that out is to do a slow titration. Start at like 5 milligrams and go up to 30 over the course of 2 weeks and see how they do.
And then that liposomal or the...
Oh yeah, so there's a lot of data on liposomes and other different structured lipids as pharmaceutical and fat-soluble nutrient delivery systems. In particular, there's data on CBD, there's data on Q10, and there is evidence that these liposomal systems are a therapeutic agent that increases bioavailability. And the question for me would be about the manufacturing process. Are they GMP? Do they have the type of traceability systems built in that if there was a recall of their product, that anybody would know what to do? And when you think about that from a user perspective of supplements, GMP is absolutely essential in my eyes from a how do we conduct business kind of thing. But in general, you're going to see a lot of different claims being made about liposomal systems that are not substantiated. And that it is a structure function claim in the eyes of the FDA, but there are people that have data, and there are studies showing that it does improve the uptake. Good question. Anybody else? Yay. Let's get ready for Decker.